The hospice room smelled like disinfectant and death, a combination that had become as familiar to Rhett Colburn as motor oil and brake fluid. He stood beside the narrow bed, watching his wife's chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths. The afternoon sun filtered through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar patterns across the white sheets that seemed to swallow Lainey's diminished frame. She looked fragile under the thin hospital blanket, her once vibrant auburn hair now brittle and sparse from months of chemotherapy. The treatments had stolen more than her hair. They'd carved away the fullness from her cheeks, left dark circles rimming her eyes like bruises, and given her skin that waxy pallor he'd grown to recognize in the other terminal patients he'd seen during his daily visits. Rhett. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort. He leaned closer, catching the faint scent of the vanilla perfume she still insisted on wearing even now. You need to promise me something. The beeping of monitors filled the silence between them. Room 314 had been their second home for the past 3 weeks, ever since the doctors had given up trying to fight the lymphoma that was consuming her from the inside out. Rhett had memorized every stain on the ceiling tiles, every crack in the painted walls, every sound the old building made as it settled around them. Anything. He took her hand, noting how cold her fingers felt against his palm, how the wedding ring he'd placed there 12 years ago now hung loose on her diminished finger. The band was white gold, simple and elegant, chosen because Lainey had said she wanted something that would last forever. You'll be okay without me. Lainey's eyes searched his face with an intensity that seemed impossible given her weakened state. You always were the strong one. Even when we first met, you had this certainty about you, like you knew exactly who you were and what you wanted. Rhett felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the careful control he'd maintained throughout her illness. In 39 years, he'd never been one for tears. His father had taught him that men solve problems instead of crying about them, and that philosophy had served him well through military service, building his business, and navigating the practical challenges of adult life. But now they came anyway, hot and unwelcome, blurring his vision as he looked down at the woman he'd planned to grow old with. Don't talk like that, he said, though they both knew the doctor's prognosis. Dr. Holden Baines had been direct about the timeline. 3 months had turned into 6 through sheer stubbornness and expensive treatments, but the lymphoma was winning. The last round of chemotherapy had failed to shrink the tumors, and Lainey had made the decision to stop fighting. Lainey smiled, the same crooked grin that had caught his attention 12 years ago at that coffee shop on Burnside. She'd been reading a paperback novel, something with a lurid cover about romance and adventure, completely absorbed in the story while chaos swirled around her. The espresso machine was broken. The barista was arguing with a customer about change, and rain pounded against the windows, but Lainey had sat in her corner booth like an island of calm concentration. I love you. You know that, she said now, her voice growing weaker. Even when I was difficult, even when I complained about money or the house or your work schedule, I loved you. I want you to remember that. I love you too. The words felt inadequate, too small to contain everything he'd felt for her over the years. Love seemed like such a simple word for something that had reshaped his entire existence, that had made him want to be better than he was. She closed her eyes, and for a moment Rhett thought she'd fallen asleep. Her breathing had grown more irregular over the past few days, with longer pauses between each breath that left him counting seconds until the next one came. The nurses had explained that this was normal, part of the process, but knowing didn't make it easier to witness. Then she squeezed his hand one last time, her grip surprisingly strong. Take care of yourself, she whispered, her eyes still closed. Promise me you'll find someone who makes you happy. Don't spend the rest of your life alone because of me. Rhett kissed her forehead, tasting salt from his own tears. Her skin felt paper-thin beneath his lips, translucent in a way that made her seem like she was already half gone. He stood there for another minute, watching her breathe, memorizing the moment, because some part of him understood that this might be the last real conversation they'd ever have. The machines continued their steady beeping, marking time with electronic precision. Outside the window, Portland went about, its business traffic moved along the streets. People hurried between buildings under umbrellas. Life continued with indifferent momentum. But inside room 314, time seemed suspended, caught between the weight of goodbye and the impossibility of letting go. Finally, Rhett forced himself to walk away. Each step felt like tearing away part of himself. But he'd learned over the past 6 months that staying beside her bed every moment wouldn't change the outcome. She needed rest, and he needed air that didn't smell like dying. The hallway stretched before him, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with the kind of institutional persistence that made everything feel slightly unreal. His boots echoed against the polished linoleum as he made his way toward the elevator, past other rooms containing other families facing their own private endings. Behind him, the door to room 314 remained open, and he could still hear the steady beep of monitors keeping track of what little life remained in the woman he'd planned to grow old with. Rhett stopped at the nurse's station to ask about visiting hours for tomorrow. The young woman behind the desk was on the phone with what sounded like a pharmacy, discussing medication delivery schedules in the patient tone of someone who'd had the same conversation dozens of times. Her nameplate read Amanda, and she looked tired in a way that suggested double shifts and too much coffee. While he waited, Rhett stared at a bulletin board covered in thank you cards and photos of former patients. Some showed families celebrating remissions and recoveries, but others were memorial photos, smiling faces of people who'd lost their battles in rooms just like the one he'd just left. The display was meant to be inspiring, but it felt more like a reminder that medicine had limits, that some fights couldn't be won no matter how hard you fought. Two nurses emerged from a supply closet nearby, their voices low but not quite whisper quiet. Hospital workers developed a certain vocal range for sensitive conversations, loud enough to communicate clearly, but quiet enough not to disturb patients or families. Unfortunately for them, Rhett had learned to listen carefully during his months of hospital visits, and the acoustics in the hallway carried their words clearly. "I still can't believe Dr. Baines is going through with this," the first one said. She was tall and blonde, with tired eyes that suggested she'd been working in oncology long enough to see too much suffering. Her name tag read Jasemi, and she carried herself with the competent authority of someone who'd learned to navigate medical crises without falling apart. "The whole thing makes me sick," replied the other nurse, a petite brunette named Claire whose scrubs were decorated with tiny cartoon hearts. Despite the cheerful uniform, her expression was grim. Faking a death for a woman he's sleeping with? And she's not even pregnant anymore. What a mess. Rhett's hand froze halfway to the pen he'd been reaching for to sign a visitor log. The words hit him like ice water, each syllable distinct and unmistakable. Pregnant? Faking a death? The mundane sounds of the hospital ventilation systems, distant conversations, electronic beeping suddenly seemed too loud, overwhelming his ability to process what he'd just heard. "At least Dr. Martinez is finally asking questions," Jasemi continued, adjusting her grip on an armload of medical supplies. "Someone needs to report Baines before this gets worse. The man's lost his mind. I heard she lost the baby last month," Claire said, lowering her voice even further. "So now what? They're still going through with the whole charade just for the money? That poor husband has no idea what's coming." The nurses moved past him toward another patient room, their conversation shifting to medication schedules and shift changes, the kind of routine medical discussion that formed the background noise of hospital life. They disappeared into room 308, leaving Rhett standing motionless beside the nurse's station, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Dr. Holden Baines, Lainey's oncologist, the man who'd been treating her for lymphoma since her diagnosis 6 months ago, who delivered the terminal prognosis with such convincing sadness, who'd explained treatment options with the kind of clinical compassion that made families trust him with their most desperate hopes. The same doctor who'd just held Rhett's shoulder 2 days ago and said, "I'm sorry we couldn't do more for her. But you should know that Line A is facing this with remarkable courage. Not everyone handles terminal illness with such grace." Rhett walked to the elevator in a daze, his mind racing through possibilities and explanations. The nurses had to be talking about someone else. Some other patient, some other doctor. Not Line A. Not his wife who was dying upstairs, who'd spent the last 6 months fighting for every additional day they could have together. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside, watching the numbers count down as he descended to the parking garage. The descent felt longer than usual, as if the building had grown taller while he'd been visiting his wife, as if the distance between her room and the outside world had expanded beyond normal physical dimensions. His hands shook slightly as he fumbled for his truck keys. Once inside his Ford F-150, Rhett gripped the steering wheel and stared at the concrete wall in front of him, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and damp concrete, familiar scents that usually grounded him in practical reality. But today, reality felt unstable, full of possibilities he didn't want to consider. But deep down, a cold certainty was already taking root. Details that hadn't made sense before suddenly aligned like puzzle pieces clicking into place. The way Line A had insisted on seeing only Dr. Baines, refusing second opinions even when Rhett had offered to pay for consultations at OHSU or the Mayo Clinic. Her reluctance to discuss her treatment in detail, always deflecting his questions with statements like, "You wouldn't understand the medical terminology," or "I don't want to worry you with all the technical stuff." The speed with which her condition had deteriorated also seemed suspicious in retrospect. 6 months ago, she'd been perfectly healthy. No symptoms, no warning signs, nothing to suggest the aggressive lymphoma that had supposedly been growing inside her. The diagnosis had come after a routine checkup, but when he'd asked to speak with Dr. Baines about the timeline and treatment options, Line A had insisted she wanted to handle the medical discussions herself. And pregnant? Line A hadn't been pregnant. They'd been trying for years without success, a source of quiet disappointment that had led to expensive fertility treatments and increasingly strained conversations about their future. Her illness had put those dreams on indefinite hold, another loss in a series of losses that seemed to define their recent life together. Rhett started the truck and drove home through Portland's evening traffic, his mind running calculations with mechanical precision. If the nurses were right, if this was some elaborate deception, then everything he thought he knew about his life was a lie. Every tear he'd shed, every prayer he'd whispered, every moment of grief and fear and desperate hope, all of it had been theater for her benefit. The implications were staggering. If Line A was faking her death, she had a reason. And if she was pregnant by another man, that reason was becoming clearer with every mile he drove toward home. The house on Southeast Division felt too quiet without Laney's presence, though Rhett realized now that her absence might be more calculated than he'd understood. He'd spent the last 6 months adjusting to her prolonged hospital stays, learning to cook for one and sleep alone, but this felt different. Final in a way that went beyond medical prognosis, he moved through their modest 2-bedroom home like a detective examining a crime scene, seeing familiar objects with new eyes. In the kitchen, he opened a refrigerator and stared at the bottles of expensive supplements Line A had claimed helped with her nausea and fatigue. $60 each, special ordered from a company that specialized in cancer support treatments. He'd never questioned the cost, $200 a month for pills that were supposed to give her strength and improve her appetite. Now he examined the labels more carefully. The company name was real, but when he looked closer at the expiration dates and lot numbers, something seemed off. The printing quality was inconsistent, and the font didn't quite match what he remembered seeing on legitimate pharmaceutical products. The master bedroom told a similar story of subtle deceptions hidden in plain sight. Laney's nightstand drawer contained prescription bottles with labels from Dr. Baines' clinic, medications with names he couldn't pronounce but had trusted were necessary for her treatment. Rhett examined them under the bedside lamp, noting details he'd overlooked before. The dates were consistent with her treatment timeline, but something nagged at him. He'd handled insurance paperwork for his shop employees for years, dealing with everything from workers' compensation claims to prescription drug coverage. These labels looked almost right, but not quite. The font was slightly wrong, the paper quality different from what he remembered seeing on his own prescriptions from legitimate pharmacies. More disturbing was what he found in the bottles themselves. Instead of the serious-looking capsules he'd expected, Most contained standard over-the-counter vitamins and supplements. Expensive placebos designed to maintain the illusion of ongoing medical treatment. Her phone was still plugged in beside the bed, the screen dark and innocent-looking. Line had reset it 2 weeks ago, claiming she'd been having technical problems and want a fresh start. At the time, he'd offered to take it to the repair shop where he'd developed relationships with technicians who could fix almost any electronic problem, but she'd insisted on handling it herself. "I need to learn to be more independent with technology," she'd said. "What if something happens to you? I can't rely on other people to fix every little problem." The comment had seemed reasonable at the time, even admirable. Now it felt like evidence of premeditation. Rhett picked up the device and powered it on. The home screen showed only default apps, no personal photos or messages, no trace of the digital life she'd accumulated over years of marriage. Everything was clean, sterile, carefully erased. But he knew something about phones that Line didn't a factory reset, didn't always wipe everything clean, especially if the process wasn't completed properly. As someone who'd been troubleshooting electronic systems in cars for over a decade, he understood how data recovery worked. Modern vehicles were essentially computers on wheels, and understanding their software was part of his job. He connected the phone to his laptop using a charging cable and ran a basic recovery program he'd used before to retrieve lost diagnostic information for vehicle computers. The software was designed for automotive applications, but data was data. Regardless of the device that stored it. 20 minutes later, fragments of deleted files began populating his screen. Most of the recovered data was corrupted or incomplete partial text messages with missing context, corrupted photos that showed only scattered pixels, fragments of app data that meant nothing without their associated programs. But audio files were harder to fully erase. The compression algorithms used by phones created multiple copies of voice recordings, scattered across different sectors of memory, and complete deletion required specialized tools that most people didn't know how to use properly. The first few clips contained nothing useful pocket dials that had recorded muffled conversations, background noise from restaurants or shops, the kinds of accidental recordings that accumulated on anyone's phone. Then he found one that made his blood run cold, Lainey's voice, clear and healthy, without the weakness that had characterized her speech for months. Rhett never asks questions. "We'll be gone before he realizes I was ever alive." The recording was time-stamped from 3 weeks ago, during a period when she'd supposedly been too weak for extended conversations. A male voice responded, slightly distorted but audible. "You sure about the timeline? The insurance policy needs to be active for at least 6 months before." The recording cut off, corrupted beyond recovery. Rhett played it again, then a third time, adjusting the audio levels and trying to clean up the background noise. There was no mistaking his wife's voice or the casual cruelty in her tone. "We'll be gone before he realizes I was ever alive." As if he was nothing more than an obstacle to be circumvented, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be considered. The phrase revealed something beyond simple infidelity or financial desperation. It suggested a level of contempt that went deeper than disappointment or boredom. She wasn't leaving him for someone else, she was erasing him from her life, so completely that his existence became irrelevant to her future. He found 2 more partial recordings. In one, Line was laughing, actually laughing about something someone had said. The sound was bright and genuine, nothing like the forced cheerfulness she'd managed during her worst days in the hospital. In another, she was discussing travel arrangements to somewhere warm, mentioning Arizona and new identities with the casual tone of someone planning a vacation rather than committing federal crimes. The final recovered file was the most damaging. A phone conversation where Lainey's voice was clear and animated. "The pregnancy was perfect timing, even if I lost it," made the whole story more believable. A dying woman carrying her husband's last hope? Rhett ate it up completely. Static filled the recording for several seconds before her voice returned. "Bain says the death certificate will be ready by Friday. After that, we just need to wait for the insurance investigation to close, and we're free." Rhett closed the laptop and sat in the darkened bedroom for a long time, processing the scope of his wife's betrayal. The woman upstairs in that hospice bed wasn't dying. She was planning to disappear, to take whatever money she could steal from him and start a new life with someone else. The pregnancy mentioned by the nurses had been real, but not his child, another man's, used as a prop in an elaborate performance designed to maximize his emotional investment in her fictitious suffering. The tears he'd shed at her bedside now felt like mockery. Every expression of love, every promise to stay strong, every moment of grief he'd experienced over the past 6 months, all of it had been theater for her benefit. She'd watched him cry and felt nothing except satisfaction that her performance was convincing. But Rhett Colburn wasn't the kind of man who broke down when faced with betrayal. 20 years in the military had taught him to compartmentalize emotional damage and focus on problem solving. 15 years of running a business had shown him how to deal with people who try to cheat him. He was the kind who got methodical, who planned carefully, who fixed problems permanently. He opened a laptop again and began researching Dr. Holden Baines, starting with professional credentials and working his way toward personal information. If Line wanted to play games with his life, she was about to learn that some people were better at games than others. Dr. Holden Baines had constructed an impressive professional facade. The website for his practice, Cascade Oncology, featured professional headshots and testimonials from grateful families, the kind of carefully curated online presence that inspired confidence in desperate people facing terminal diagnoses. His biography mentioned 15 years of experience, a medical degree from OHSU, and specialized training in end-of-life care that made him seem like exactly the kind of compassionate physician families wanted during their darkest hours. The testimonials were particularly convincing. Dozens of patients and family members praising his gentle bedside manner, his willingness to explain complex medical information in understandable terms, his ability to provide hope without false promises. On paper and screen, he looked exactly like the doctor who'd been treating Line with such apparent dedication. But Rhett had learned to look deeper than surface impressions, especially when dealing with people who made their living convincing others to trust them. In the auto repair business, he'd encountered a share of smooth talkers who promised more than they could deliver, and he developed an instinct for spotting inconsistencies between image and reality. He spent the next 3 days conducting surveillance while officially taking time off from his shop to grieve. His employees understood completely. Mike Hendricks had handled the day-to-day operations while Rhett dealt with Lainey's illness, and everyone knew how much he loved his wife. Taking a few days to process her loss seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. Dr. Baines had predictable habits, the kind of routine that suggested either genuine professionalism or carefully maintained cover. He drove a silver BMW 3 Series, conservative enough to project medical respectability without flaunting wealth inappropriately. Every morning at 7:45, he stopped at the same Starbucks for a large coffee, black, and a protein box that he ate in his car while reviewing what appeared to be patient files. On Wednesday morning, Rhett followed him from his suburban home to the clinic, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping the BMW in sight. Dr. Baines lived in a nice neighborhood, not ostentatious, but comfortable in the way that suggested successful medical practice and careful financial planning. The house was colonial style with mature landscaping, the kind of place where neighbors trusted each other and children played safely in front yards at the clinic. Rhett positioned himself in the parking lot with a clear view of both the main entrance and the side door that led to what appeared to be a private wing of the building. For 2 hours, he watched patients come and go, elderly people with walkers, middle-aged women wearing scarves to cover hair loss, family members with the hollow-eyed look of people facing loss. The rhythm of genuine medical practice was unmistakable. Patients arrived for scheduled appointments, spent appropriate amounts of time inside, emerged looking either hopeful or resigned, depending on what they'd learned. Everything appeared normal, legitimate, exactly what you'd expect from a busy oncology practice. Then, at 11:47 a.m., he saw her. Line walked through the side entrance with the confident stride he remembered from their early years together, before illness had supposedly robbed her of strength and vitality. She wore a wig similar to her natural hair color and dark sunglasses that covered most of her face, but there was no mistaking her posture or the way she moved her hands when she was concentrating. More importantly, there was nothing wrong with her walk. No weakness, no fatigue, no sign of the bone pain that had supposedly made movement difficult during her worst days. She moved like someone in perfect health who was simply trying not to be recognized. Rhett felt his grip tighten on the steering wheel, but his expression remained calm. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Anger made people sloppy, caused them to make mistakes that could be exploited by clever opponents. And whatever else Line might be, she was clearly clever enough to orchestrate an elaborate deception that had fooled him for months. He pulled out his phone and started recording as Line disappeared into what appeared to be a private wing of the building. The video quality wasn't perfect from his position across the parking lot, but it was clear enough to establish her identity and physical condition. She stayed inside for 43 minutes, long enough for a substantial consultation or planning session. When she emerged, she was carrying a small duffel bag that hadn't been with her when she went in. The bag appeared heavy, as if it contained something substantial: documents, medical supplies, maybe even medication bottles like the ones he'd found in their bedroom. After she drove away in a car he didn't recognize, a red Honda Civic with temporary plates, Rhett remained in the parking lot for another hour. He watched Dr. Baines leave for lunch and return with takeout from a nearby Thai restaurant, the kind of normal behavior you'd expect from a legitimate physician managing a busy practice. But the pieces of the puzzle were becoming clearer. Dr. Baines wasn't just Laney's co-conspirator. He was providing the medical credentials and documentation needed to make her fake death appear legitimate. The duffel bag probably contained everything she'd need to disappear: forged death certificates, medical records supporting her fictitious illness, maybe even identification documents for whatever new identity she'd assumed. That evening, Rhett drove to Eugene to visit Opal Tillman, Laney's older sister. The trip took 2 hours through steady rain, giving him time to plan his approach carefully. Opal had never particularly liked him. She'd always considered him too ordinary for her ambitious younger sister, but she might have answers he needed, especially about Laney's past relationships and her capacity for deception. Opal lived in a tidy duplex near the university, in one of those neighborhoods where graduate students and young professionals shared space with longtime residents who'd watched the area slowly gentrify around them. She answered the door wearing paint-stained clothes, a brush still in her hand, clearly interrupted in the middle of an art project. Her studio doubled as her living room, canvases propped against every available wall. The paintings were abstract landscapes, swirls of color that suggested mountains and rivers without quite defining them. They were good, better than hobby-level work, though probably not quite professional quality. Rhett, she blinked in surprise, taking in his unexpected presence with the kind of confusion that suggested she'd been completely absorbed in her work. "What are you doing here? How's Line holding up?" The question hit him harder than he'd expected. For a moment, he almost gave the answer he'd been preparing for friends and co-workers, that she was comfortable, that they were taking things one day at a time, that the doctors were doing everything possible. The familiar script of terminal illness, designed to acknowledge reality while maintaining hope. Instead, he said, "That's what I can talk about. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Opal set down her brush and crossed her arms, studying his face with the kind of attention artists applied to subjects they were trying to understand. "Okay, come in." The living room smelled like paint and turpentine, familiar scents that reminded him of high school art classes and the dreams of creativity he'd abandoned for more practical pursuits. Opal gestured him toward a couch that had seen better days, its fabric worn soft from years of use. "Has Line ever had lymphoma?" he asked without preamble. "Any cancer? Any serious illness at all?" "What kind of question is that?" Opal's eyebrows rose. "She's been sick for months. You've been living through this with her. Before this year, in her medical history, anything that would put her at higher risk for developing cancer." Opal frowned, clearly unsettled by his directness. "No, never. Line was always the healthy one in our family. She used to joke that she'd lived to be 100 out of spite, just to prove she was tougher than everyone else." Her expression shifted as she studied his face more carefully. "Why are you asking me this? What's going on? Did she ever mention Dr. Holden Baines before her diagnosis?" "No, I don't think so." Opal moved to her kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, offering him one with the automatic hospitality of someone who'd grown up in a house where visitors were always offered refreshment. "Rhett, you're starting to worry me. What's going on? Did something happen at the hospital?" He accepted the water, but didn't drink, using the moment to consider how much to reveal. Opal might be more loyal to her sister than to the truth, but she also had a reputation for honesty that bordered on bluntness. If anyone would give him straight answers about Lainey's character, it would be someone who'd known her since childhood. "What do you know about Lainey's past relationships?" he asked. "Before we met." "Why does that matter now?" "She's dying, Rhett. Whatever happened in the past? Please, just answer the question." Opal sighed and settled into a chair across from him, tucking her feet under her in a gesture that made her look younger than her 42 years. She dated around a lot in her 20s. Never anyone serious until you came along. Well, except for that real estate guy she was obsessed with for a while. Real estate guy? Some hotshot flipper who made big promises about getting rich together. This was maybe 15 years ago, right after she finished community college. She was convinced he was going to be the next Donald Trump or something. Opal rolled her eyes at the memory. I told her he was a sleazeball who would promise her anything to get what he wanted, but she wouldn't listen. They had this on-again, off-again thing for about 2 years. What was his name? God, I haven't thought about him in forever. She rubbed her forehead, thinking. Noel something. Greaves, maybe? He lived in Arizona, I think. Phoenix or Tucson. One of those desert cities where people go to reinvent themselves. Rhett felt another piece click into place. Did Lainey ever mention faking her own death? Opal's eyes widened, and she set down her water glass with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. What the hell kind of question is that? Did she? Opal looked around her studio as if seeking an escape route from an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. She used to joke about it sometimes, usually when she was mad at someone or felt trapped by circumstances. She'd say things like, "I should just fake my death and disappear," or "Wouldn't it be perfect if everyone thought I was dead and I could start over somewhere else?" But that was just talk. Fantasy stuff that people say when they're frustrated. She said she'd fake her death one day to get away clean. Maybe something like that, yeah. But Rhett, those are just words. People say crazy things when they're feeling trapped or overwhelmed. It doesn't mean they actually plan to do it. Rhett stood and handed back the untouched water glass. "Thank you for being honest with me." "Wait." Opal grabbed his arm as he headed for the door, her artist's fingers surprisingly strong. "What's this about? Is Lainey okay? Did the doctors find something new?" He looked back at her, and for a moment his composed mask slipped enough to reveal the cold anger beneath. "No, Opal. She's not okay. But she's going to be exactly what she chose to be." The drive back to Portland gave him time to process what he'd learned and plan his next moves. Lainey hadn't just found a lover, she'd reconnected with someone from her past who shared her talent for deception and her willingness to hurt innocent people for personal gain. The pregnancy mentioned by the nurses had probably been part of their original plan, a way to make her disappearance more emotionally devastating and therefore less likely to be questioned. But even after losing the baby, they decided to proceed with the scheme. The money was too tempting, and Rhett was too trusting, and the plan was already too far advanced to abandon by the time he reached home. Rhett had decided that Lainey and her conspirators were about to learn the difference between targeting someone who trusted completely and targeting someone who had nothing left to lose. Back in Portland, Rhett began the painstaking process of reconstructing his wife's secret life, approaching the task with the same systematic methodology he used to diagnose complex automotive problems. Every deception, no matter how sophisticated, left traces, digital footprints, financial records, communication patterns that could be analyzed and understood by someone with the right skills and sufficient patience. He started with their joint finances, pulling statements from the last 18 months and examining every transaction with forensic attention. The pattern emerged slowly but clearly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Small withdrawals at first, $200 here, $500, they're always amounts that could be explained by medical expenses, household needs, or the kind of minor purchases that accumulated during any marriage. But over the past 6 months, coinciding with Lainey's supposed diagnosis, the amounts had grown larger and more frequent. cash withdrawals that totaled nearly $15,000, all taken from ATMs in different parts of the city. When he mapped the locations, they formed a pattern that suggested she'd been deliberately trying to avoid using the same machine twice, probably to make the transactions harder to track. More troubling were the charges he hadn't noticed before, payments to companies he didn't recognize, made with credit cards he thought were used only for household expenses. When he researched the businesses online, he found they were shell corporations with minimal online presence and no clear business model. The kind of setup people used when they wanted to move money without leaving clear tracks for investigators or suspicious spouses. Line had also opened new credit cards without telling him, a discovery he made when he ran a credit check on both their names. 3 cards with substantial balances, all used primarily for cash advances and wire transfers rather than retail purchases. The applications had been submitted online using their home address, but she'd arranged for the cards and statements to be delivered to a post office box he'd never heard of. The life insurance policy was perhaps the most damaging discovery. Line had taken out a $500,000 term life policy 8 months ago, right around the time her supposed symptoms had started appearing. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Insurance companies were always suspicious of policies purchased shortly before claims were filed, and 8 months was just long enough to pass initial scrutiny. But instead of naming Rhett as the beneficiary, which would have been normal for a married couple, she'd created a trust with an obscure financial services company in Nevada. The trust documents were complex enough to discourage casual examination, filled with legal terminology that made them seem legitimate to anyone who didn't read them carefully. When he called the insurance company, pretending to be updating beneficiary information, the customer service representative confirmed what he'd suspected. I show the policy was purchased by Line A. Colburn, with the Greaves family trust listed as sole beneficiary. The trust oversight contact is listed as Noel Greaves in Sedona, Arizona. Rhett hung up and stared at the wall of his home office, a small room that had once served as Lainey's craft space before her supposed illness had made such activities impossible. The shelves still held supplies for scrapbooking and jewelry making, hobbies she'd abandoned months ago, claiming that chemotherapy had robbed her of the concentration and fine motor skills needed for detailed work. Now he wondered if she'd simply been too busy planning her escape to maintain her usual interests. Noel Greaves. The same name Opal had mentioned Lainey's former boyfriend from Arizona, the real estate flipper who'd made promises about getting rich together. 15 years later, it seemed he was still making the same promises, only now they involved stealing from her current husband rather than simply dreaming about future success. The next phase of his investigation required skills he developed reluctantly, learning computer security out of necessity when his business had been targeted by hackers trying to steal customer information. Modern auto shops maintained extensive databases of client information addresses, phone numbers, vehicle identification numbers, service histories, and protecting that data had become as important as protecting physical inventory. But he spent the next 2 days hacking into Lainey's email accounts, a process that required more patience than technical expertise. She'd been careful to use different passwords than their shared accounts, but Rhett had advantages she hadn't considered. He knew her childhood pet's name, her mother's maiden name, her high school best friend's nickname, and the answers to most of the security questions that companies use to verify identity. After several attempts and some creative variations on familiar themes, he gained access to a Gmail account she'd created under a slightly different spelling of her name. The inbox contained over 200 messages spanning the last 8 months, creating a detailed record of her deception that would have impressed him with its thoroughness if he hadn't been its primary target. The earliest emails were between Line A and Dr. Baines, discussing treatment options in language that made it clear they weren't talking about actual cancer therapy. References to maintaining believable symptoms, establishing timeline credibility, and managing family expectations revealed the carefully planned nature of their deception. Later exchanges involved detailed logistics, creating false medical records that would pass casual inspection, establishing relationships with complicit medical staff, and coordinating with funeral homes that specialized in discreet services for clients who valued privacy over traditional ceremony. But the most revealing correspondence was between Line A and Noel Greaves. Their affair had rekindled 6 months before her supposed diagnosis, conducted through encrypted messages and coded language that suggested both paranoia and sophistication. The pregnancy had been real. Noel was the father, but she'd miscarried early in the second trimester. Instead of abandoning their plan, they decided to proceed anyway. The emotional impact of her fake death would be even greater if Rhett believed she'd died carrying his child, and the life insurance money, combined with what they could steal from his accounts, would be enough to set them up permanently in Arizona. Noel had already purchased a house in Sedona under a false identity, using money from real estate deals that skirted the edges of legality. Line had been preparing new identity documents for herself, working with the same people who'd helped Noel establish his Arizona persona. The emails revealed a relationship based on mutual selfishness and shared contempt for the people they were deceiving. Line wrote about Rhett with casual cruelty, describing him as pathetically trusting and too simple to see what's happening right in front of him. Noel responded with similar dismissiveness, referring to Rhett as your mark and discussing him like a problem to be solved rather than a human being whose life they were destroying. The final email in the chain was dated 3 days ago, sent while Rhett had been sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand and trying to comfort her through another supposedly difficult night. And everything is set. Or sign the insurance papers without reading them. Typical. Baines has the death certificate ready to file. I'll be gone by Friday, and we can move forward with the transfer. Can't wait to leave this boring life behind and start fresh with you. The desert sounds perfect after all this rain. See you in paradise. Rhett printed every email, every financial statement, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, organizing them into folders with the same attention to detail he'd learned from military service. Document everything, verify sources, maintain chain of custody. If this ever went to court, he wanted records that would hold up under scrutiny. Then he began phase 2 of his plan, turning Laney's careful preparations against her. Rhett had built his auto repair business through careful planning, systematic problem solving, and attention to details that less experienced mechanics often overlooked. A properly functioning engine required every component to work in harmony, and sabotaging that harmony required nothing more than introducing the right problems in the right sequence. That he approached the destruction of his wife's scheme with the same methodical precision, identifying the critical systems that supported her plan and developing strategies to disable them without revealing his involvement. First, he secured the money. On Thursday morning, he visited 3 different banks where they maintained accounts, claiming suspicious activity and potential identity theft. The process required paperwork and verification, but as the primary account holder, he had legal authority to protect their assets from unauthorized access. I'm concerned that someone may have gained access to our account information, he told the bank manager at their primary branch, a woman named Patricia who'd known them as customers for over 5 years. My wife has been in the hospital for months, and I've noticed some unusual transaction patterns that don't match our normal spending. Patricia was immediately sympathetic and helpful, walking him through the fraud protection procedures while expressing concern for Laney's health. Within an hour, all joint accounts were frozen pending investigation, cutting off access to nearly $80,000 in combined checking and savings accounts. The process was repeated at 2 other banks with similar results. By noon, Line A and her conspirators had lost access to virtually all their liquid assets, leaving them dependent on whatever cash they'd already withdrawn and whatever resources Noel could provide from Arizona. Next, he protected his business assets. Colburn Automotive represented 15 years of careful development, worth approximately $200,000 in equipment, inventory, and customer relationships. He couldn't sell it quickly without raising suspicions, but he could temporarily transfer ownership to someone he trusted completely. Mike Hendricks had worked alongside him for 8 years, starting as a junior mechanic and gradually developing into a full partner in everything but name. More importantly, he was someone Rhett trusted completely, a rarity in his world, and even more valuable now that he understood how completely his trust could be violated. "You sure about this?" Mike asked as they signed the paperwork in the shop's cramped office, surrounded by automotive manuals and framed certificates from training programs they completed together. Transferring ownership, even temporarily, that's a big step. What if something goes wrong? I need to keep the business safe while I deal with some personal issues related to Laney's condition, Rhett replied, choosing his words carefully. When this is over, we'll transfer everything back, plus interest for the inconvenience. And if something happens to you? Rhett looked up from the documents, meeting his friend's concerned gaze directly. Nothing's going to happen to me, Mike. But if it does, the shop is yours free and clear. You've earned it 10 times over. They shook hands, and Rhett felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever came next, his life's work would survive, protected by someone who understood its value and would maintain the standards that had built their reputation. Phase 3 involved digital warfare, using skills he developed reluctantly over the years as automotive systems became increasingly computerized. Modern cars were essentially computers on wheels, and understanding their software was no longer optional for serious mechanics. But infiltrating Laney's online presence required more advanced techniques than diagnostic software and programming interfaces. He found what he needed on the dark web, hiring a freelancer who specialized in digital asset recovery for a fee of $2,000 in cryptocurrency. The service was advertised as helping people recover access to their own accounts after forgotten passwords or technical problems, but Rhett understood that the same techniques could be used for less legitimate purposes. Within 48 hours, he had access to accounts Laney thought were secure, including email addresses she'd never mentioned and social media profiles she'd created under assumed names. The extent of her deception was staggering. She'd been building her alternate identity for months, creating a digital history for someone who didn't exist and establishing connections that would support her new life. Her flight reservations were easy to find and easier to manipulate. She'd booked tickets to Phoenix under her false identity, scheduled to depart the day after her supposed death. Rhett canceled the flights and used her own credit card information to book new ones to destinations she'd never planned to visit: Miami, Seattle, Denver, Chicago. He created a confusing trail of reservations and cancellations that would waste valuable time for anyone trying to follow her movements. Each booking was confirmed with different email addresses and phone numbers, creating the appearance of a sophisticated escape plan that led nowhere useful. He also accessed her new identity documents, driver's license, social security card, and passport applications under the name Leslie Crane. The documents were professionally forged, probably costing thousands of dollars and representing months of careful preparation. With a few strategic modifications to the digital files, he introduced errors that would trigger automatic flags during any official verification process: a mismatched social security number here, an incorrect birth date there, subtle changes that wouldn't be noticed during casual inspection but would cause problems the moment someone tried to use the documents for anything official. The most elegant sabotage involved her communication with Noel. Rhett intercepted their message chain and began feeding false information to both sides, carefully crafting messages that would increase suspicion and paranoia while maintaining the writing style and vocabulary patterns they'd established. To Noel, he sent messages claiming Laney was getting cold feet and considering backing out of their arrangement. References to second thoughts about leaving her comfortable life and concerns about the risks they were taking. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, but enough to plant seeds of doubt about her commitment to their plan to Laney. He sent warnings that Noel was planning to cut her out of the deal and keep all the money for himself. Subtle hints about conversations with other women and references to backup plans that didn't include her. Again, nothing that would cause immediate panic, but enough to make her question whether she could trust her co-conspirator. Within days, their carefully coordinated plan began showing cracks. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, a lesson Rhett understood better than most. The messages between them became shorter and more guarded, filled with the kind of paranoid questioning that destroyed effective partnerships. Finally, he set the trap that would bring them all down. Using Dr. Bain's compromised email account, he sent anonymous tips to local law enforcement, indicating suspicious activity at the clinic. Reports of insurance fraud, falsified medical records, and patients who weren't actually patients. He included just enough verifiable information to prompt a genuine investigation without revealing his own involvement. The tips were carefully crafted to seem like they came from a concerned medical professional who'd noticed irregularities but was afraid to report them directly. References to specific dates and procedures that could be verified, combined with suggestions about where investigators might look for additional evidence. T.O. Noel, he sent travel itineraries and meeting locations in Sedona, using Laney's compromised email address. Romantic messages about finally being together, complete with specific times and places where they could celebrate their new life together. The messages were written in Laney's style, filled with the kind of intimate details that would convince Noel they were legitimate. T.O. Line. He sent urgent messages claiming Noel needed to meet immediately to finalize their financial arrangements. Different locations, overlapping time frames, just enough confusion to ensure they'd both show up in the same area at the same time without coordinating their arrival. That'd be why the time Laney's fake death was scheduled to occur. Red had laid the groundwork for her very real downfall. He'd learned patience from 15 years of running a business, dealing with difficult customers and complex repairs that couldn't be rushed. He'd learned ruthlessness from 6 months of believing his wife was dying, watching her suffer through treatments that were nothing more than elaborate theater for his benefit. Now all he had to do was watch his plan unfold, confident that people who made their living through deception would eventually be destroyed by their own lies. The red rocks of Sedona stretched across the horizon like ancient sentinels, their rust-colored surfaces catching the late afternoon sun and throwing backlight in. Shades of gold and amber. Line stood on the balcony of the rented condo, 3 stories above the tourist-filled streets, breathing in the dry desert air that felt like freedom after months of Portland's oppressive gray skies. The transformation was complete. The wig was gone, replaced by a short brunette cut that changed her appearance dramatically. The style was edgier than anything she'd worn during her marriage, asymmetrical and modern in a way that made her look younger and more sophisticated. Designer sunglasses hid her eyes, and she moved with a slight limp, a final touch to sell the story of someone recovering from a near-fatal illness. "Perfect," she said to her reflection in the sliding glass door, practicing the expression of grateful survivor mixed with mysterious past that she'd perfected over the past week. In Portland, she'd been Mrs. Rhett Colburn, wife of a small-town mechanic with grease under his fingernails and simple dreams that never extended beyond his next paycheck. Here in Arizona, she was Leslie Crane, a woman with enough mystery to be interesting and enough apparent wealth to open doors. The insurance money alone would set them up for years, $500,000 that Rhett would never see, payment for 12 years of boredom and missed opportunities. Add to that what she'd managed to siphon from their joint accounts, and they'd have enough to buy the kind of life she'd always deserved. Maybe a house in Scottsdale with a view of Camelback Mountain, or something overlooking the ocean in California. Anywhere but the gray, rain-soaked mediocrity of Portland, where ambition went to die and people settled for comfortable routines instead of chasing their dreams. The condo was a temporary staging area, rented under her new identity and furnished with the kind of Southwestern elegance that made her feel sophisticated. Leather furniture in rich browns, Native American art on the walls, a kitchen with granite countertops, and appliances that probably cost more than Rhett made in a month. This was the kind of place she belonged, not the modest 2-bedroom house on Southeast Division with its leaky faucets and outdated fixtures. A knock at the door interrupted her daydreaming. She smoothed her new hair and walked to the entrance, expecting to see Noel's familiar smile and the bottle of champagne he'd promised to bring for their celebration. Finally together, finally free, finally ready to start the life they'd planned during months of careful coordination. Instead, she found him standing in the hallway with his hands shoved deep in his pockets and a scowl that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Finally," she said, stepping aside to let him in while trying to keep her voice light and welcoming. "I was starting to worry something had gone wrong with your flight." Noel brushed past her without the usual kiss or embrace, his movements sharp with barely controlled agitation. He was 42 years old, with silver at his temples and the kind of artificial tan that came from expensive treatments rather than honest outdoor work. in his tailored clothes and Italian shoes. He looked like the successful businessman he claimed to be, someone who belonged in places like Sedona, where wealth was displayed casually and success was assumed rather than questioned. But today, something was different. The confidence that had attracted her 15 years ago, and again 6 months ago, was replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like panic. "We need to talk," he said, settling into the leather armchair without invitation, his usual charm nowhere in evidence. "Okay." Line poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle she'd opened earlier, a California Chardonnay that cost more than she used to spend on groceries in a week. "Talk about what? I thought we were supposed to be celebrating." "The money, Line. The insurance payout hasn't come through." She felt her stomach clench, but kept her expression neutral through years of practice hiding disappointment and frustration. "What do you mean?" Bain said everything was ready to file. "The death certificate should have been processed days ago. I mean, the insurance company is asking questions. They want additional documentation, medical records from multiple sources, verification for physicians who weren't involved in your treatment." Noelle's voice carried an edge of panic she'd never heard before, high and tight in a way that made him sound younger and less sophisticated. "My contact at the company says there's been some kind of flag placed on the account." "That's impossible." Line set down her wine glass with more force than necessary, the expensive crystal making a sharp sound against the granite countertop. "Baines handled everything. The death certificate is legitimate. The medical records are in the system. Everything was designed to pass standard verification procedures." "Yeah, well, something went wrong." Noel stood and began pacing, his Italian shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled agitation. "I've got 40 grand invested in this house, plus all the setup costs for your new identity, plus the money I had to front for the medical stuff. If this doesn't pay off, it will pay off." Laney's voice sharpened, taking on the edge it always developed when people questioned her planning or suggested she hadn't thought things through completely. "You're panicking over nothing. Insurance companies always ask questions for large payouts. It's routine investigation, not evidence that they suspect fraud. Is it routine for them to contact the deceased's husband directly?" The words hit her like ice water, causing her to freeze with the wine glass halfway to her lips. "What?" "They called Rhett yesterday. Asked him to verify some information about your medical history and treatment timeline." Noel stopped pacing and stared at her, his expression shifting from panic to accusation. "You told me he was completely clueless, that he'd never question anything, never look beyond what you told him." Laney's mind raced through possibilities and explanations, searching for some reason why the insurance company would contact Rhett directly instead of working through their normal channels. Standard procedure was to handle claims through designated beneficiaries and authorized representatives, not to involve family members who weren't directly connected to the policy. "He doesn't know anything," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded uncertain, lacking the confidence that had carried her through months of careful deception. "You better hope not, because if this falls apart, I'm not going down with you." Noel grabbed his jacket from where he'd thrown it on the couch, his movements sharp with anger and fear. "I've got too much to lose, and too many people who depend on me keeping my mouth shut about other things." "Wait." Line caught his arm as he headed for the door, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit jacket and the tension in the muscles beneath. "Where are you going?" "We're supposed to be celebrating. We're supposed to be planning our future together. There's nothing to celebrate yet." He pulled free of her grip with more force than necessary, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. "Fix this, Line. Figure out what went wrong and fix it, or we're both screwed." The door slammed behind him, leaving her alone in the condo that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The sound echoed through the expensive space, emphasizing how isolated she was, how dependent on other people's cooperation her entire plan had become. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting behind the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful but instead felt ominous, like a warning of storms approaching from the horizon. Line spent the next 24 hours trying to reach Dr. Baines, making call after call to numbers that either went straight. to voicemail, or had been disconnected entirely. His office phone played a generic recording about being temporarily unavailable, and his personal cell number returned an automated message stating the number was no longer in service. The clinic was her last hope for immediate answers. She drove there in the rented Honda, taking back roads to avoid main traffic areas where security cameras might record her presence. The building looked normal from the outside, same professional signage, same well-maintained landscaping, same appearance of legitimate medical practice. But when she approached the main entrance, she found it temporarily closed due to administrative issues, sign taped to the glass door, with no indication of when services might resume or how patients could access their medical records. Through the windows, she could see that the waiting room was empty, chairs stacked against the walls as if the space was being prepared for deep cleaning or renovation. Panic began to set in, the kind of cold fear that started in her stomach and spread outward until her hands shook and her vision narrowed. Everything was falling apart, but she couldn't understand how. The plan had been perfect, every detail carefully coordinated, every potential problem anticipated and addressed. She returned to the condo and opened her laptop, intending to check the status of their joint bank accounts. Maybe she could access enough money to buy time while they sorted out the insurance problem. Even if the big payout was delayed, they should have enough savings to keep them comfortable while they figured out what had gone wrong. The login page appeared normal, familiar blue and white graphics of the bank's website that she'd accessed hundreds of times over the years. But when she entered her credentials, an error message popped up in red text. Account access restricted due to suspicious activity. Please contact customer service immediately for verification and restoration procedures. Her hands trembled as she tried the other accounts, typing passwords with increasing desperation as each attempt returned the same message. Checking account, savings account, the credit card she'd opened secretly, all frozen, all inaccessible, all suddenly beyond her reach. No, 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 she whispered, clicking frantically between browser tabs, trying different combinations of usernames and passwords, hoping she'd simply made a typing error. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. Her email inbox contained a series of automated messages that made her blood run cold, each subject line more threatening than the last. Urgent. Fraud alert Oregon State Insurance Division subject. Investigation notice policy hashtag 47291. X automated message. Suspicious activity. Detected account frozen. Federal Bureau of Investigation interview. Request insurance fraud alert was the worst. A formal document that looked like something from a legal proceeding rather than a routine business. Communication. It listed her real name alongside several aliases, including Leslie Crane and 2 other identities she'd been developing as backup options. Somehow, investigators had connected all her false identities to the insurance claim, unraveling months of careful preparation. The message indicated that law enforcement had been notified and that all related financial accounts were being examined as part of a federal investigation into organized fraud. At the bottom was a name that made her stomach drop. Dr. Holden Baines, under investigation for medical fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal insurance statutes. Line slammed the laptop shut and began pacing the small condo, her mind racing through possibilities and escape options. Everything was falling apart faster than seemed possible, as if someone had deliberately triggered a cascade of failures designed to destroy her plan completely. But who could have known? She'd been so careful, so thorough in her preparations. The only people who knew the full scope of the plan were herself, Noel, and Dr. Baines, and none of them had any reason to expose the others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, causing her to jump as if the sound was a gunshot. This is what happens when you underestimate the people you betray. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the tile floor, the sound echoing through the condo like broken glass. Rhett. Somehow, her boring, trusting husband had figured out what she was doing. But how? And more importantly, what did he plan to do about it? She scrambled to retrieve the phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. Another message appeared as she watched. Check your email. You'll want to see what I sent to the FBI. With trembling fingers, she opened her email app and found a new message in her inbox, sent from an address she didn't recognize but suspected belonged to her husband. The subject line was simple and terrifying: evidence of fraud, complete documentation. The message contained a single attachment, a compressed file labeled with her real name and the current date. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Audio recordings from her phone that she'd thought were deleted. Financial records showing the money transfers and account manipulations. Email chains between her, Noelle, and Dr. Baines revealing the full scope of their conspiracy. Everything she'd thought was hidden or destroyed, organized and presented like evidence in a criminal trial. A third message arrived while she stared at the screen. Noelle received a similar package. So did the authorities. You have about 24 hours before they issue warrants. Use the time wisely. Line A grabbed her purse and car keys, her mind racing through escape options that seemed increasingly futile. She could drive to Mexico, try to cross the border before the authorities realized she was still alive, or catch a flight to somewhere without extradition treaties, using one of the backup identities she'd prepared for emergencies. But as she reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy boots, multiple people, voices speaking in the clipped, professional tone she recognized from police procedural shows. The sound of people who were trained to handle dangerous situations and weren't interested in negotiation. A sharp knock echoed through the condo, followed by a voice that left no room for misunderstanding. Federal agents. Open the door. Line A backed away from the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might be visible through her shirt. Through the peephole, she could see at least 3 people in FBI windbreakers, including a woman holding what appeared to be an arrest warrant. Line A Colburn, we know you're in there. Open the door now. She looked around the condo desperately, searching for another exit, any way to escape the trap that had closed around her. The balcony overlooked a 30-foot drop to the parking lot below, possible to survive, but likely to result in broken bones that would make further escape impossible. The bathroom window was too small for an adult to fit through, and there was no other way out. 15 years of dreaming about escape, months of careful planning, and it all came down to this: trapped in an expensive condo with nowhere to run and no one to help her. The knocking grew more insistent, accompanied by the sound of someone testing the door handle. Miss Colburn, if you don't open this door in the next 30 seconds, we'll be forced to breach it. This is your final warning. With her last few seconds of freedom, Line A tried to send one final message to Noelle, warning him to run, to get as far away as possible before the authorities found him too. But when she unlocked her phone, she found a new text from the same unknown number. Noelle was arrested 2 hours ago, trying to cross into Mexico with $40,000 in cash. The money was traceable to your husband's accounts. He's already talking to federal investigators about your arrangement. You're on your own. The door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire condo, suddenly filling the space with federal agents shouting commands and pointing weapons. Line A raised her hands and sank to her knees on the cold tile floor, finally understanding that she'd lost a game she hadn't even realized she was playing. As they handcuffed her and read her rights in voices that were professional but not unkind, one thought echoed through her mind. She'd underestimated Rhett Colburn completely, and that mistake was going to cost her everything. The federal courthouse in Portland was an imposing building of gray stone and stern columns, designed to project the weight and authority of justice rather than comfort or welcome. Rhett sat in the back row of the gallery, watching as his wife was led into the courtroom in orange prison scrubs and shackles that clinked softly with each step. 6 months had passed since her arrest in Sedona, and the intervening time had not been kind to Line A. Prison food and fluorescent lighting had taken their toll, aging her in ways that went beyond simple time. Her hair had grown out to reveal gray roots she'd always hidden with expensive coloring treatments, and without makeup and designer clothes, she looked older than her 36 years. More importantly, she looked defeated. The confident woman who'd orchestrated an elaborate fraud had been replaced by someone who seemed smaller, diminished by the consequences of her choices. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, built on evidence that Rhett had provided but never testified about directly. Audio recordings that captured her discussing the fraud in her own words. financial records showing systematic theft from their joint accounts, email chains between her, Noel, and Dr. Baines that revealed the full scope of their conspiracy. Dr. Baines had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing details about how he'd created false medical records and coordinated with funeral homes that specialized in discreet services for clients who wanted to disappear. His testimony had been devastating, clinical, and precise in the way that only a medical professional could manage. Noel Greaves had already pled guilty to his role in the conspiracy and was serving 4 years in federal prison. His cooperation had been less helpful than the prosecutors had hoped apparently. Line had kept many details of the plan to herself, trusting him only with the information he needed to play his specific role. But the most damaging evidence came from Line herself. In the weeks following her arrest, she'd attempted to claim that Rhett had been abusive, that she'd faked her death to escape domestic violence and start a new life free from his control. The story might have generated sympathy from a jury, if not for the audio recordings from her own phone. The prosecutor played several clips for the jury, including one where Line was laughing about how easy it was to manipulate boring Rhett, and another where she described her husband as the perfect Mark because he trusted people too easily and never asked uncomfortable questions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor had said during closing arguments, this is not a case about a desperate woman trying to escape an abusive relationship. This is about someone who systematically exploited the trust and love of another person for financial gain, causing emotional trauma that may never fully heal. When asked to testify, Rhett had appeared via video link to protect his identity and prevent potential retaliation. He'd spoken calmly and precisely, describing how he'd discovered his wife's deception and the systematic way she'd stolen from their joint accounts while pretending to be dying. Did you ever suspect your wife was planning to fake her death? The prosecutor had asked. No, Rhett replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. I trusted her completely. I believed she was dying, and I was prepared to spend everything I had to make her comfortable in her final months. I took time off work, rearranged my entire life, planned for a future without her. How did you feel when you learned the truth? Betrayed, but not surprised once I started looking for evidence. The signs were everywhere. I just never had reason to look for them before. Do you forgive your wife for what she did? The question hung in the air for several seconds before Rhett answered, his words carrying the weight of careful consideration. No, forgiveness is for people who make mistakes, who act impulsively and regret their choices. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice she made every day for months. She chose to let me believe she was dying. She chose to steal money we'd saved together. She chose to plan a future with another man while I planned to grieve her. Those aren't the kind of choices you forgive. The courtroom had been completely silent during his testimony, the kind of quiet that suggested everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant. When he finished, several jurors were wiping their eyes, and even the judge looked affected by his words. Now, sitting in the courtroom as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, Rhett felt a sense of completion that went beyond simple satisfaction. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring balance, ensuring that actions had consequences, proving that some betrayals were too fundamental to ignore or excuse. Line Colburn, the judge began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many cases like this one. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, and money laundering. These are serious crimes that strike at the foundation of trust that holds our society together. Line stood beside her public defender, her head bowed in what might have been remorse, but looked more like self-pity. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming she'd been coerced by Noel and Dr. Baines, manipulated by people who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability. The jury hadn't believed her. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $127,000 to cover the financial losses incurred by the victims of your crimes. 12 years. Rhett did the math automatically, a habit developed through years of calculating repair costs and project timelines. Line would be nearly 50 when she got out, assuming she served the full sentence. Her prime years, the ones she'd planned to spend enjoying stolen money in Arizona, will be spent in a federal correctional facility learning what it meant to live with the consequences of betraying people who trusted her. As the bailiff led her away, Line turned and looked directly at him for the first time since her arrest. Her eyes held a mixture of hatred and something that might have been regret, though it was probably just self-pity for getting caught. Rhett held her gaze for a moment, his expression calm and unreadable. Then he stood and walked out of the courtroom, ready to return to a life that was finally, completely his own. 6 months later, Rhett stood in front of his newly renamed business, Colburn Precision Auto. The sign was simple black letters on white background, no fancy graphics or promotional slogans, reflecting the same attention to detail and straightforward approach that had built his reputation over 15 years of honest work. Business was better than ever, fueled by a combination of excellent service and community respect for how he'd handled his personal crisis. Word had spread through Portland's tight-knit network of small business owners and working-class families about what had happened to him, and people appreciated both his skill as a mechanic and his dignity in dealing with betrayal. They brought in their cars and trucks, knowing that he'd fix what was broken and tell them the truth about what it would cost. No games, no hidden fees, no attempt to sell unnecessary services. Just honest work at fair prices, performed by someone who understood that trust, once lost, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Mike Hendricks had officially returned ownership of the shop the day after Laney's sentencing, refusing to accept any payment for his months of stewardship despite Rhett's repeated offers. "You'd have done the same for me," he'd said with the kind of shrug that dismissed gratitude as unnecessary between real friends. "Besides, I learned a lot about the business side of things. Consider it education." The shop itself looked exactly the same tool chest, same diagnostic equipment, same coffee pot that produced fuel rather than beverage, but somehow felt different. Cleaner, maybe, or just free from the weight of deception that had hung over everything during Laney's supposed illness. That on a rainy Thursday afternoon that reminded him of the day his old life had ended, Opal Tillman stopped by the shop. She approached the service counter tentatively, clutching a ceramic coffee mug like a peace offering, her expression nervous in the way of someone who wasn't sure how they'd be received. "I brought you this," she said, setting the mug on the counter with careful precision. It was hand-painted with a simple design of mountains and trees, the kind of functional art that took real skill to execute properly. "I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted you to have something." Rhett picked up the mug and examined it, noting the quality of the craftsmanship and the care that had gone into its creation. The glaze was perfectly even, the design balanced and proportional. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating something that was both beautiful and useful. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. "You didn't need to do this." "Yes, I did." Opal met his eyes directly, showing the same artistic honesty that characterized her paintings. "I should have warned you about her. I knew what she was capable of, what she'd done to other people in the past, and I kept quiet because she was my sister. That makes me part of what happened to you." "No, it doesn't." Line made her own choices. You can't be responsible for decisions other people make, even if they're family. "Maybe, but I could have made different choices too." She paused at the door before leaving, looking back with an expression that mixed regret with something that might have been admiration. "You did what nobody else could, you know. You beat her at her own game. Most people would have just let her disappear and try to move on." After she left, Rhett set the mug on a shelf in his office where he could see it while he worked. It wasn't about forgiveness. He still didn't believe in forgiving the unforgivable, and what Line had done fell into that category. But it was about moving forward, about building something better from the wreckage of what came before. The afternoon mail brought the usual collection of bills and business correspondence, along with one envelope that made him pause. His name and address were written in familiar handwriting, with a return address from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. Line had written to him. Rhett held the envelope for a long moment, feeling the weight of whatever message she tried to send. Part of him was curious about what she might have to say after months in prison, whether she developed any genuine understanding of what she'd done, or was simply looking for someone to blame for the consequences of her choices. He opened the envelope and read the first line. I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to understand why I did what I did. The marriage wasn't working, and I felt trapped in a life that wasn't what I dreamed of. You were a good man, but you were never going to be enough for someone like me. I needed more than you could give me, and I took the only way out I could see. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding. Maybe someday you'll realize that what I did was better for both of us. You're free now to find someone who actually wants the kind of simple life you're satisfied with. Rhett read the entire letter, noting how it managed to sound like an apology while actually being a justification. Even from prison, even after losing everything, Line was still trying to make her betrayal seem reasonable, still convinced that her desires justified any amount of cruelty toward other people. He walked to the small wastebasket beside his desk and dropped the letter among the used shop rags and discarded invoices. It made a soft sound as it landed, no different from any other piece of trash that had outlived its usefulness. Some people spent their lives looking backward, trying to understand or justify or find meaning in the pain they'd caused or received. Rhett preferred to look forward, toward problems he could solve and futures he could build with his own hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Portland streets, washing away the dust and grime that accumulated during the dry months. Inside Colburn Precision Auto, work continued at a steady pace. Engines were diagnosed and repaired, customers were treated fairly, and trust was rebuilt one honest transaction at a time. Rhett had work to do, and for the first time in months, that work felt like enough.